Bonjour and welcome to our second Paris review for the Autumn Winter 24 womenswear collections. I'm editor Hetty Mahlich and this is our fashion features editor Joshua Graham.
Hi.
We want to talk to you about a group of shows which were very much thinking about this idea of a pragmatic yet very playful, real and pretty wonderful and tactile woman. I want to start with us talking about Courrèges, Undercover and Dries van Noten, because interestingly all these shows were on Wednesday and each of the designers referenced a very specific idea of a woman, both through their clothes but also really notably through the soundtrack. June Takahashi at Undercover had Wim Wenders on the soundtrack talking about this idea of the everyday working woman. Dries interestingly said in the press notes, this is a woman that dares to cut her own fringe, which I love, all the models had fringes. And the soundtrack was a kind of broken down the take on Sade and kind of mixed with birdsong. And then Courrèges was a mix of Chopin but then a woman's breath. And these were all kind of incredibly gestural collections, very much about the idea of clothes and how you wear them and the feeling of the wearer. And I think I definitely feel quite refreshed by this idea of pragmatic women's clothing but that has intelligence and fun to it.
Yeah, it was almost like all three of these designers were really looking at this insular idea of womanhood and this insular idea of femininity, but all in very different ways. Undercover was, I thought, very beautiful because the poem that Wim Wenders was kind of reciting as the soundtrack was watching a woman work, and it was kind of following the life of a 40-year-old single mom. And I thought the clothes almost really reflected that because they were these everyday wardrobe staples, from at home in a white tank and jeans to office wear, but the clothes kind of were extended or expanded with these wispy printed fabrics or sequins, and it was like who you present yourself and who you are within. And again, that idea of insular lives, who you are in public, who you are inside, what you can show and what you can't show or choose not to show.
I think it's important, that idea of contradictions and being able to be more than one thing as a woman, and that women are these very multifaceted beings, especially when you think of them as kind of the working woman. I love those contradictions in this Undercover show, kind of the opening trouser, which June was very much thinking about this idea. He quoted adhesion, kind of one fabric, one silhouette, one item of clothing kind of becomes another. So the trousers in this opening look kind of open up around the waistband and it's kind of empty space but starts to echo this kind of very idea of a garment on the top. And this kind of, I thought it was also interesting that both in Undercover and Dries there was this kind of contradiction and adhesion of one garment with then this idea of kind of almost at Undercover it was kind of this foiled tassels which kind of came out of the hems of trousers and of shoes, of sneakers, of tops, of heels. And then Dries also had this kind of metallic knit, but it had this
like
kind of
lurex.
Yeah, it was like, yeah, exactly. And in these kind of acidic greens, bright deep blues, and I almost love thinking about that in terms of like a working woman, that it's kind of like the things a kid would love and that you'd kind of have scattered over the playroom, but then are mixed in with this kind of, it's like a working woman and a woman that can function and move and live, but that doesn't have to be in kind of this complete quiet luxury wardrobe, you know?
Yeah, it almost took me back to, and dare I say it, COVID dressing. We saw sweatpants on the runway, we saw kind of button-up shirts that were worn the other way around so you could see the collar on the back from underneath these really gorgeous lurex shiny knits. I thought it was really interesting that, again, that idea of home life and what does that look like, what does comfort look like, how do you express yourself as comfortably as possible, and I thought that was really apt with what Dries presented.
Yeah, I totally agree. And what did you think of Courrèges? Because you were there, I was not.
Yes, I thought it was really interesting because, like you said, it was this heavy breathing and this kind of woman's voice saying, take it slow, like inhale, exhale. It was a very sexually charged collection, to say the least, and the clothes really reflected that because everything was quite body hugging and sheer and wrapped around the body, really accentuating the body, and then covered up. I know in the press notes Nicola said that all of these coats were made to be almost protective layers, which I thought was a bit interesting in the sense that a lot of the collection was so stripped back. To have these big kind of fur-colored coats as protective layers, it felt interesting and a little kinky because it was a real mix of texture and material, and all I could think about was feel and how these feel on the skin. The shoes were latex, which I thought were really funny. I think Hari Neff said in a Womenswear Daily video that she felt like she was wearing condoms on her feet. And I thought that was...
I think that sense of tactility is really key
really
to this
interesting.
group of designers that we're talking about, and to Wednesday's kind of day of shows. We're also going to talk about Rick Owens in a minute as well, but there was this feeling of tactility, and it felt like, I think it comes back to that thing of that it's about such a personal sense of dressing. It's not about an objective sense of dressing. These are clothes for very real people and a very real kind of woman, but also infused with this kind of sense of imagination. Because sitting there at these shows, you know, with, for instance, at Undercover with this Wim Wenders soundtrack, which is just kind of spoken word, there's no music. You very much have to sit there and imagine these characters for yourself. You're also using the models that come out, but it makes you engage in an imaginative way where you're kind of imagining who these characters are, who these women are. It's like reading a story. It engages that part of your brain, I think, in a different way.
I think I really see that with Dries and with Undercover. I do want to pose a question to you as a woman.
Tell me.
This sexually charged energy of Courrèges and this idealized female form that Nicola is really kind of tapping into, that I dubbed the Courrèges hot girl, because she's tall and thin and really, like, again, this like really idealized woman, and how he's presented sensuality and sexuality from this idealized male point of view. I'm kind of questioning where the reality is in that. He again referenced that Courrèges pocket right up the pelvis. I don't know, it just makes me question whether or not this is a realistic interpretation or a realistic approach at thinking about female sensuality.
I do think it comes back into that thing of who you're talking to, and I think the Courrèges audience is a younger, different audience to the Dries and the Undercover audience in terms of, or maybe not even audience, maybe in terms of who they're thinking about. Like, I don't think that woman or that girl at Courrèges is at all from the same universe as Dries and Undercover, and I think that I definitely don't find the sensuality thing empowering. That I find there's something so sensual in what Dries and Undercover did. Like, it's a completely different thing, but I think it comes out to that tactility. There's something really, like, I would feel so sexy in some of those clothes, but they're probably the least skin revealing or body hugging clothes at all. And I think maybe it's also a matter of taste and that thing that we need different things in the market. But I do think Courrèges is tackling a younger, different consumer who kind of still wants that idea of this fantasy woman that maybe doesn't actually exist.
I get what yes, I completely understand the difference between consumer base and who he's kind of tapping into. It's, I don't know, I think the bells ring off in my head because it's almost like it's so idealized. It's such a fantasy. It's such a fantasy of sexuality and sexual representation that it almost veers into pornographic territory in the male gaze. Of course, Nicola has tapped into this hot girl market, and Courrèges does really well in France among those, that type.
I think it comes back to that thing of like the more idealized fantasies of beauty, that fashion is the best and worst.
No, exactly. And I actually really loved the collection, and I loved the presentation.
Is that what you want me to wear?
Could you imagine? No, it's what I want to wear if I was this idealized, sexy woman. But then again, it just makes me question like ideas of misogyny and patriarchy.
I do think it comes, without getting stuck on this for too long, I do think it comes into that idea of, it feels like when you're thinking about Dries or Undercover, you feel like you can kind of, I find it sexy because it's like you you can express whoever you want to be within that and take parts of it, while it's like the Courrèges girl is like, you need to be that girl. It's like there's no room for like difference in that. It's kind of like you need the full look, you have to kind of be that. What do you know what I mean? There's no range, which I don't think is such a bad thing.
No.
Like that's a particular look, but I think it's a very different idea of thinking about women.
Yeah.
Should we talk about Balmain and Olivier Roosting? Because if anyone has an idea of his woman, it's Olivier and what he's done since over the past kind of, God, so long, 10, 11, 12, 13, like 14 years or something, since 2009.
So Olivier said that in the past few seasons, him and his team have really dug into the archives, Sarah Balmain's archives. Last season, I believe, he looked at the rose and Pierre Balmain's fascination with the rose, and that became a real recurring motif. He wanted to still tap into this idea of Balmain's green thumb, but this time he went a little more personal. He thought about Bordeaux, where he grew up with his adoptive parents, and the wineries and the food culture that comes with it. So grapes were a big motif in this collection. Rain was a big motif in this collection, with these really amazing trench coats that were almost deconstructed and blown up, but also very stripped back. They weren't the utilitarian, folded, cinched in. They almost felt like armor. And I think for this collection that Olivier did, he was really looking at this idea of resilience and beauty and resilience. A lot of the models who walked were older women, and to me almost maybe him paying homage to his adopted mother, which I thought was really beautiful. He also played a lot with these over-the-top, again, it's really showing off Balmain's savoir-faire, taking this great motif and making metallic, almost sculptural embellishments and buckles. Another motif he really played with was escargot, which I thought was really funny.
I like how subtle that was, though, on buttons, and it wasn't
it was on buttons.
It wasn't like a big snail print.
No, it wasn't a big snail print, but it was a big shell, like, bustier in like this mirrored gold, which I thought was really funny, because looking at the collection as a whole, it was like Olivier was also paying homage to 80s opulence and the grand couturiers like Yves Saint Laurent, Pierre Balmain, which I think is really interesting when we look at Paris as a whole so far. And this designers are really kind of showing restraint. They're playing with minimalism a lot more. They're finding nuance in the minutiae. And for Olivier to go kind of full on opulence and glamour, part of me wants to question that and think of, well, it's not with the times, it's not vibing with the times. But again, kind of looking at Bordeaux and his upbringing and his trajectory into fashion, there is a big notion of escapism and how fashion can transport you to different worlds, how fashion can make you dream and have a fantasy of something grander than where you are. So as a collection, I thought it was very loving and quite beautiful.
I think that's also the success of what Olivier's done at Balmain, is it's always been about, everyone doubted him when he got there and he was so young, he was early 20s. And what he's done is kind of created, I think he's one of the very few people we have today who's a creative director who's gone to a house and has made it his own. Like, it feels like Olivier and Balmain are so interwoven, and I think it's really beautiful to see him starting doing more collections which are drawing on kind of his own kind of personal ties. Like last season with the men's, he worked with different artists to kind of pay homage to his own heritage, but then there are the clothes themselves, I feel like they're definitely very different to the kind of the Balmain really structured tailored jacket and the kick flare pants. It's very different to that era. It's like, as you say, kind of looking to a different kind of to couture, and we're getting kind of a very but a much more elegant silhouette. Not that that's wrong to say, but you know what I mean.
I think I know exactly what you mean with this kind of, there is an elegance to this collection, and I saw it specifically with a few of the looks which featured kind of Duchess satin draping over these midnight velvet bodysuits, which created almost a negative space for jewelry and for the rest of the garment. And it was almost that kind of peeled back restraint, or that unlayering of these couture ideas, which I thought was also really interesting and really beautiful.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of like a restrained glamour in a really beautiful way. I want to finish talking about this idea of restrained glamour because I actually think that leads quite well into what Rick Owens was doing. So Rick, for men's last month, and then for this women's show, he's moved his show from the Palais to Tokyo to being inside his home. I really respect how he talks very explicitly in his press release last month and this month about how abhorrent everything is that's happening in the world, and the idea of kind of the intolerance that we're seeing. That's kind of the word that Rick keeps referring to, this intolerance for people, and just the general mood of the world, which Rick is kind of known to respond to. And Rick was thinking about this intolerance of his own childhood. His father took away the TV and then would read these storybooks to him by Edgar Rice Burroughs, and kind of the covers of these are kind of like Tarzan. So he'd very much sit there as a child, imagine, you know, you think about your dad sitting there reading to you, you see the illustrated cover of these characters, and then you're sitting there kind of imagining these faraway worlds while he's growing up in this small town of Porterville. But he kind of was desperate to leave and go into these fantasies and these worlds that he created in his head. And I think it's interesting thinking about this idea of escapism and fantasy, but then tied together with this idea of moving your shows to your house, this idea of thinking about the intolerance of the world, wanting to almost pull back, and it comes back to what we've been talking about, this kind of these contradictions and these tensions, which I think we're seeing designers respond to. This women's collection was a continuation of the men's, which is kind of what Rick usually does. They usually have a tie-through, but even kind of more pulled back in terms of silhouette, these really streamlined silhouettes. So kind of mermaid, fishtails. I love that Rick calls these siren skirts. It kind of speaks to that idea of reading storybooks and thinking about kind of fantasy. This collection was about collaboration, as we also saw last month. Some of these skirts were made out of recycled bicycle tires by a Parisian artist called Matisse DiMaggio, who's part of the BDSM community here and specialises in kind of using rubber to make things out of. Rick collaborated with another series of artists last month, so it's kind of nice to see this pulling back, but then working with people in different ways to kind of, there's always a dialogue with Rick. It never feels like, you know, what we were thinking about with Courrèges. It's never this idea of someone. It's, I don't know, maybe it's because Rick's part of that and he wears the clothes. It comes back to what we were talking about at the beginning. These clothes are about a sense of feeling. It's about how you feel when you wear them. This collection was had a really beautiful tactility to it. There was kind of recycled cashmere in this collection. Felt this kind of, there was this rawness to it, whether it was kind of these almost capes that kind of swaddled the shoulders, or the rawness of kind of a long floor length coat. There was this, just coming back to that idea of tactility, which brings this realness to it. This kind of, as I said at the beginning, this overall kind of streamlined, languid silhouette. All the models in these knitted kind of caps that kind of protect you. The knitwear in this collection, all of them kind of wearing bodysuits, little pants, but like covered from head to toe. People like Hannah from Fecal Matter walked in the show, Stephen from Fecal Matter walked last month. There's always this kind of continuation, and it just feels like this tactile, slow conversation, and it was just incredibly beautiful. And I think it really rounded up for me this idea of a group of designers who have a sense of a woman and a wearer.
Very evocative, like very, there's like, everything feels so charged with emotions.
Yeah.
And hearing you talk about Rick almost makes me think like these designers are really tapping into their inner child and making these collections and thinking about ideas of why they are in fashion, why they pursue fashion, why they fell in love with fashion in the first place. I think tactility plays a big part in that, because it's how you feel, how it makes you feel, how you find comfort in these clothes, and how you wear them rather than how you're going to be perceived in them.
I think I feel very refreshed by this group of collections. Tactile clothes, pragmatic but with fantasy. I think pragmatic fantasy is maybe my takeaway word, takeaway phrase. So we'll leave you with that pragmatic fantasy, and we will see you next time. Thank you for watching. Bye.